right, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Marks. I'm on the MPSE Board of Directors. First, some MPSE announcements. The spring edition of our magazine, MPSE Wavelength, is in members' mailboxes and is also online. You can read the full digital edition of this magazine at mpse.org/wavelength. At the MPSE store, don't miss our summer sale that's currently going on. On our site, you'll find our new international collection of items, as well as mugs, water bottles, stationery, tote bags, and more. Head to mpse.org/store to see what best suits your style, and use the code MPSE Summer 23 to get 20% off of your entire purchase. On our MPSE YouTube channel, you'll find lots of great sound advice events from the past few years. Head there to learn more from the sound teams behind Better Call Saul, Mr. Robot, Back to the Future, Jerry Bruckheimer films, Halo Infinite, and much more. And thank you for coming to tonight's very special sound advice event. I'd like to introduce your host for the evening, fellow MPSE board member, Perry Lamarca. Perry, please take it away.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for showing up tonight. It's really my pleasure to welcome a fellow board member again, Amber Funk. Amber is a very active music editor, and her credits go back almost 20 years and encompass shows such as The High School Musical, Dave, Daisy Jones and the Six, The L Word. Her company also works on the show Ted Lasso, and she just seems to be one of the busiest people working in this area that I know of. And so we're really excited to have her here and kind of ask her some questions and figure out kind of what's going on with the music or the world of music editing in 2023. So I would like to start and just say hi, Amber, and thanks so much for doing this.
Hi, Perry. I'm glad to be here. It's my pleasure.
This is really exciting. I want to start by just mentioning one little thing. I grew up as a composer, and I've been in love with film music forever and ever. And I remember when I was young, just trying to digest everything I possibly could on film music. And I bought a book, I think by, I don't know if it was Fred or Roy Pendergrast. It might've been the earliest book ever written on music editing. And I remember reading it and thinking at the end of it that this really takes a special kind of person with way more patience than I think I could ever muster, and attention to detail than I think I could ever muster. And so here you are, and I'm happy to kind of spend some time with you tonight. But I'd like to ask you kind of how you got started and what your background is in terms of you know, both the industry, but also in terms of music or music editing, and just if you could enlighten us, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. So I guess in terms of my musical background, I think that's the most logical place to start, right? I was involved heavily in music as a kid and growing up in, I mean, they don't really do this anymore, but they had a music program at my school, you know, in elementary school, where I started playing the clarinet. So I played the clarinet in elementary school and through junior high. I did not join marching band in high school because I thought I was too cool for that, I guess. I don't know. And no, I was actually very nerdy, and I was like, I need one less nerd thing on my list. And I also took dance. I took dance I think from the time I was 5. I was also involved in choir in high school, and then I later learned to play the guitar and the bass guitar and some piano. So that's sort of like my musical background. And actually playing the guitar, I played in a rock band for a bit of time. And how I got started in this actually came from that rock band, because somebody that joined our band had gone to an audio engineering school. And after they did the schooling, they actually joined our band. But when I quit the band for creative differences, I then went to this school in Arizona called the Conservatory of Recording Arts and Sciences.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was a much smaller, obviously, back then than it is now. I think it's a much bigger place that focuses on a lot of different areas of sound. But back then it was a lot for producing and recording albums, which I thought, you know, I'm going to be a record producer, right as that industry was kind of dying in terms of like being an engineer and getting into that. So they had one class on post-production, and I was like, that's what I got to do. So that's kind of how, you know, my musical journey ended up over here. So I went to that school, decided I needed to post, graduated and came out and did internships. And my first internship actually was at a music editorial house. And I didn't even know that was a job that existed. I thought I was going to be a sound designer. And yeah, and then I was like, oh, this is what I need to be doing.
And so when did your interest in audio, in addition to music, kind of start? Was it through the band, or was it something earlier?
I think, you know, without realizing it, I had always been interested in audio. I was always kind of playing with recording stuff, but, you know, off of like the old Toshiba stereo that I had, or, you know, the tools that I had, the very rudimentary tools I had.
Whatever you can cobble together, yeah.
Yeah, I was always like recording myself as a kid, or recording like sounds and stuff, trying to make my own little like plays or DJs or so.
And so going from this school where I assume they talked a little bit about music editing, or at least about kind of, you know, music in film perhaps, or
Sort of, not really. I mean,
okay.
Which is, yeah, anyway, there
So
wasn't.
you came out here, you got an internship, you got a job, and all of a sudden you're discovering a whole world of possibilities that maybe didn't exist or were thought about much before then, right?
Yeah. I mean, I interned there. I interned at Dane Tracks, and which doesn't exist anymore, but was a very big sort of sound design company. My first job was as a Foley cuer. And then the music editorial company I used to work at was hiring, and I was like, oh, and that's
Yeah.
I matriculated around through the different areas of sound before I landed here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so at what point did you realize, and I guess I'm wondering whether it was maybe looking for a particular project or work, or was there something that attracted you about music editing particularly at that point, or?
Yeah, well, so I had always been in love with movies and TV, you know, since I was a kid, and I had always loved particularly like musicals or movies that sort of focused on music. So when I realized I could have those two things together, right? When I realized that that was like a job, I could put music to film. It seemed like, how did I not know this? I was destined to do this.
Yeah.
Because I was like, this is the perfect job. This is my dream job, you know?
Right. No, that's fabulous. And so, so I'm going to say, I think that this is, well, what was your first project? That's interesting to me, actually.
The first project that was like assigned to me.
Yeah, or what was the first thing you worked on that struck you, basically saying, this is what I want to do?
Oh, so interesting. So early on, really early on, I think it was the second thing I did was High School Musical. And it was because like the way that it was presented, which I know it seems ridiculous now, but the way it was presented, it was like, it was just this little movie that the Disney Channel had done, and it wasn't really a big deal. And they had come to the company and asked them if they could do it. And they said, we could put an assistant on it. And I was said assistant. And, and they were like, okay, that's fine. And that was sort of when I started to really realize what I was doing and what I was getting into and how cool it could really be.
That's wonderful. And were you temping as well as doing the final playback, or?
So back then, temping was not as much of a thing as it is now.
Okay.
I mean, it was for pilots, definitely. And I think for features also, it was like a big deal. But for like TV shows and MOWs, movies of the week, for anyone who is unaware, that wasn't as much of a thing. You know, it would be temp, or there wouldn't be music in the temp. And then and then you would just work off of that, and you'd have your spotting session, discuss where you wanted music, how the temp music was good or bad, and then, move on from there. Now temping is a much bigger part of the job than it was when I started.
I know that.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I know a lot of composers, through the years, have various feelings about temp scores. But for me, I think it just makes the job so much easier if it's done well, and it gives you a clue as to what the director wants. It gives you clues to what the dramatic momentum should be and all of that kind of stuff. And so, when it's done well, I think it's really incredibly helpful.
I agree that it's incredibly helpful in terms of like tone and pacing and all of that. I think the reason why a lot of composers don't always like it is because of temp love, and they get so attached to maybe like a singular piece of music that composers are then sort of forced into that particular, getting as close to that vibe as they can without, copyright infringement or whatever, which I think that's what they don't like to do.
Yeah. And that's a subject for a completely other. Yeah. So, and in terms of that for you, are you doing a fair amount of that kind of work now? And I guess one of the, we'll talk about temp and this part of the job for a second, if you don't mind. But it has always been amazing to me that just looking at picture that's been temped or whatever, how effective some of it is, and how dramatically effective it is, the wide range of music that is used for the temp scores. And I'm wondering, for you as a very busy and kind of well organized music editor because of your company, how do you do that? Do you cultivate or catalog, or do you have like this just encyclopedic knowledge of film music or that you can call upon? How do you manage that?
So it's kind of a variety of things. We do have a music library. So, over the years, we're collecting scores from TV shows that we've done, from movies that we've done. So we're collecting all of that. But on top of that, when you start a show now, editorial will be like, oh, do you have this score or that score? And maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you can go and search and find it and get it and download it, and you're adding that to your library as well. I think, Sharon, this is something that Sharon says that I think is very true. Sharon's my business partner. She always says that, like, I think we sort of have an intuitive ability to know what we're looking for. And if you just kind of let yourself flow with that, then that's good. And that's not very, very technical, but I do think sometimes you go intuitively like, oh, what about, Game of Thrones for this? And then you pull it up and you start listening to it and go, oh yeah, this is working. I do think some of that is based off of knowledge and experience as well. There is sort of an encyclopedic knowledge, but also there's more of like a composer knowledge, I would say. Like Cliff Martinez, everybody knows, is very like orchestral, or no, it's not orchestral, sorry, very electronic and repetitive, and like builds sort of over its repetitiveness and the electronicness. Whereas like a Max Richter is going to be more piano based, and have more, I feel like he has a lot more emotion in a very sort of like sparse way that he does things, which is very cool. You have Cristobal Tapia de Veer, who does like White Lotus. Everything he does is really unique. So you start to know the sounds of particular composers, and then you can sort of just go to their body of work if you're looking for something like that and start pulling from scores, which is, I think, also very helpful to just sort of know how somebody works, and how their general sound is. But then also, like, the fact that I worked on Castle for 8 years, if I need something that sounds like Castle, I just go and
you can pull from the library you already know.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's also really helpful.
Yeah. And how often do you get guidance from the showrunners or particular producer or director in terms of where they want to go, or has that been decided already? I mean, maybe we should also ask you, at what point in time are you working with the composer? But we start with the first.
Yeah, so typically, one of the first conversations you would have about music on the show is like the sound of it. And you would have that either with like the director or the showrunner, or maybe the picture editor, or all three. They kind of chime in and give you their ideas of the type of music they think is going to work for the show. Sometimes you don't get that. I will say sometimes you don't get that and they're like, we're not really sure. Help us.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, we'll throw some things at it and see what, see what sticks. But yeah, typically they have an idea like, oh, we want this to be Western electronic, or we want this to sound, oh God, for years it was American Beauty. We love American Beauty, can you do something like that? It's like, yeah, okay. So, sometimes they have particular scores in mind that they want to try using. Sometimes they have just a generic sound, and sometimes they don't know at all. But that is one of the first conversations you would have going into it before you start temping.
And do you sometimes get like, what would essentially be a pre-temp where say the picture editor has put stuff in to, and then you have to kind of go from there or massage it, or?
It sort of depends on the situation. On a TV show that's in like season 2 or 3, I might not be doing a lot of temping, right?
Right.
They may only ask me to temp scenes that they're having a difficulty finding stuff for. Otherwise, the assistant editor is doing it. So,
establish the sound, and so
the sound is already established. On a pilot, no, there's probably not going to be anything in there. But sometimes the editors find stuff that fits, and they'll send that to you.
Or if you don't mind, or you are then taking, say, in a situation where they don't really know what they want, or there's nothing in there, you're going to maybe give them snippets or little samples of different things, so they can and then kind of work with them to help guide what the sound of the show might be, or might become.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, on pilots and on features and stuff, temping very much is helping guide and shape the sound of the music for the show. So on pilots, frequently they're like, we're not really sure, let's figure out what works, so because they're moving at such a fast pace.
Right.
So then, you come in and you're like, oh, okay, this is a action show that should be like this. So you're pulling those, scores from your library and, putting them against picture, cutting them against picture, and sending them 3-4 options for each scene to kind of, differing options with different sounds to kind of see like what they respond to.
Right.
What they respond to negatively or positively can help just direct you in the right direction.
And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier with the basis of the temp, I think that saves the composer a lot of work too, because, and I've even heard some music editors say that they almost act as an intermediary between the director and the composer, and kind of help, make sure things are flowing along the right, thread or trend or whatever.
Yeah, that's actually like a big part of our job is interacting between producers and directors and the composers. So, oftentimes producers will be like, oh, can you get him to write, this piece in a minor key or whatever, even though they don't always know what minor keys are, but that's another discussion. But they just want it to sound sad or whatever.
Yeah.
So they're or I like this here, but I wish it changed here and shifted and did this, had this other emotion over here. So then often you're relaying that, or you're telling the composer, these are the kinds of scores they're really liking. So I would maybe go around this kind of a vibe, so that when they're presenting their first round of cues, they're already in the ballpark of what the producers and directors are liking.
Yeah, just reaffirm that hopefully, and then tweak, to get it, And I assume that you are daily dealing with picture changes and having to reconform and all sorts of stuff like that as well, correct?
Yes.
As things move along.
Yeah. I think earlier I told you something about a lock 7 on the last day of the mix.
Only 7.
I will.
That seems like such a low number.
I know. Lock 7 V2 I've seen before too. It's like, you're like, okay, listen.
Yeah, that's the it's the way of the world now. It's you know, it has
It
its,
is, yeah.
it has
But
its
it
benefits.
didn't used to be like that because they couldn't change things as quickly and easily as they can.
Yeah. Yeah, technology, you know. So I would like to actually kind of move a little bit forward on this and go to the other side of your job, which I believe to be dealing with things as after the scoring and after the songs have been recorded or whatever and figured out and licensed and all of that kind of stuff. And you're also then putting everything back in the scene and in the picture to make it all work as a final product. And I apologize if I'm speaking maybe a little remedially I'm sure there's a lot of very experienced people in our virtual audience here, but just to kind of track through the whole process. Can you talk about a little bit about what that process is like? And then I've got a couple of questions.
So specifically, you mean like prepping for the mix and then working?
Yeah, so prepping for the mix, all the stuff you've got to go through, basically. I mean, what are the material? You're getting score back from the composer. You've got licensed songs to deal with. I'm sure everything's in stems, and so you're having to deal with making that all work. And
the licensed music may not be in stems, but the score would be. So yes, you're gathering the score and the licensed music. And sometimes you have to get things from production, depending on what the show is, and because sometimes you have to carry that stuff in your session for the mixers, because it makes more sense for it to come from the music side of things. And then the other thing that we would have to deal with are like pre-records or musical numbers, as most people would know them. So all of that. Anything of that nature, essentially, yes, you have to prep and you put it in Pro Tools, and typically prior to all of that, you are cutting songs and previewing. You might preview 10, 15, 20, 30 songs for one spot. The music supervisor is generally sending you these pieces that they're curating for this spot for this show. And then you're cutting them and presenting them to the showrunners, producers, and they're making their choices. And sort of the same thing happens with score. The composer will send you stuff that they've written and you preview it for the showrunners and the producers, directors, everybody to approve and give notes on. And then once sort of everything's gotten approved, you're putting it together. Hopefully it's approved. Not always approved before you get to the next stage, but you're getting what has been approved or approved up to this point into Pro Tools to the picture, and you take that to the mix stage. And then go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and then from there, the process is, you're sort of there's the sound supervisors, right? They're in charge of basically everything else, the Foley and the sound effects and the walla and the ADR and everything else that sort of makes up the soundscape. We're sort of in charge of just the music side of it, of letting mixers know, like, hey, the producer really wanted that song to play like it was coming through the wall of another apartment, or they wanted this score to play really loud and have sound effects sort of drop away. Usually the sound supervisor would also know that, but you're sort of guiding them through.
So, but let me ask you, you are not doing that work in your session. You're just basically making notes so the mixer can then accomplish those things when they actually.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, because they have much better tools at their disposal, right? I mean, the millions of dollars that's spent on those mixing boards and they have tools at their disposal that I just don't. And they have the experience with mixing it to make it sound much better than I'm going to.
I'm curious. It wasn't tasks being delegated down to, other.
It's very rare that I will like EQ and verb something and give it to the stage. I do have to do that for quick times to present things.
Sure.
To present them in a more like realistically mixed way. So I am doing like sort of little mini mixes all the time with these quick times. But it is very rare that I would actually send that to the stage that way. It does happen sometimes, but that's because, maybe it's something that's super complicated and it took us, a month to figure out how we wanted it. So,
yeah, let me actually kind kind of jump in on that part, because you just worked on one of my favorite shows in the last year or so, which was Daisy Jones and the Six. And that featured, I think, some score, but it had a lot of vocal performances, and there was, there was a band. For those of you who haven't seen the show, basically, it kind of tracks this kind of faux Fleetwood Mac kind of, it's roughly akin to that. I don't think it's literal or meant to be literal, but it had a lot of, pre-records, live performances that had to be matched to other tracks. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like an enormously different and maybe perhaps even more complicated part of this job than just dealing with, say, a scored episode.
Yeah, I mean, that one was sort of like the dream version of that, I have to say. It was just very well done from top to bottom, from like pre-production all the way through post, where they really they took those actors and they had them in band camp for a year, so they knew how to play instruments and sing all those songs and stuff. So they really can do all of those things, and that's them singing in the studio on those tracks, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And it was always designed to have that live feel about it, rather than like a High School Musical where it sounds like a song that somebody just started up, more like that's a more fantasy kind of a musical, I would say, versus this is a more realistic one. And there is a lot of things that have to go in that. You're checking hand movements on guitar, on piano, on drums. Oh, he hit that drum an extra note. We need to make sure there's something there because we can see him on camera doing it. And there's adjusting the music to make sure that they look and sound as best as possible like a real band, right? Mm-hmm. And lip sync is another thing that has to constantly be checked and looked at. And that is something that music editors do, is we will cut lip sync, which is a whole different skill set altogether. And so that kind of a show requires that, on top of previewing all the score and doing the spotting and the quick times and cutting all the source music options for something like that.
May I go back though? When you say cutting lip sync, what do you mean by that?
So when someone is singing on camera and there's music coming out of their mouth, often it is a track that has been laid into Pro Tools, right? That is playing against picture. And you have to make sure that their lips, are matching what's supposed to be coming out of their mouth.
And then obviously sliding the whole thing, instrumental and all, so that it all matches up and still sounds, unless you can pull the vocal behind the beat a little bit or whatever, right?
Yeah, so there's different ways to do it. I take the wide out into micro approach, which is, let's take a look. Is the whole thing out of sync? Let me slide that a couple frames this way, a couple frames that way, see where it sort of sits the best overall. And then from there, this is a strange thing, but I go in and I actually look at it by phrases, because I feel like when you move phrases first, it sounds better, stays better intact musically. Mm-hmm. And by camera angles, because often you will find the sync shifts when the camera angle changes. So and then I get into the micro individual word part. So I sort of do my sync from outward in. And that's because I feel like sometimes you can shift a whole phrase, half a frame, and suddenly the whole thing looks like it's in sync. And you don't really have to go in and noodle around with each individual word. Where I think that's where sometimes it can start to sound a little hinky against the pocket of the music, right?
Sort of a less is more kind of approach, or
so sort of a less is more kind of approach in terms of lip sync. But there are times where it's that one word is just out of sync, and so you have to go in and sort of move that word, and you have to. It's a battle between. Sometimes it's a battle between the visual and the auditory, right? So
what's musical or
yes, and I always go with what's musical, but sometimes you're looking at it and you're like, that's, you know what I mean? They have to sometimes slide picture. You have to be like, listen, this picture needs to go this way a little tiny or that way a little tiny in order for this to actually look like they're singing it in sync. Because if I move it to where they are, it's going to sound like they don't know how to sing to a beat or whatever, to the melody.
Yeah. And are there any other specific challenges with doing that kind of a project as opposed to just cutting, say, an instrumental score?
Yeah, I mean, there's all the visuals, right? Because a show like that, every time they pick up a guitar or noodle on a bass or fumble with their drumsticks, you have to be paying attention to that to make sure that you have something to cover it.
I would imagine that the camera goes over to someone playing the guitar, and there's not an interesting guitar part in that part of the track, and you've got to kind of figure out how to show something. Or
yeah, you got to see like, oh, it kind of looks like he's doing this part. If I pull that little acoustic guitar from this other song and put it here, will that work? And does it work storyline wise too? Because sometimes that's the other part of it, right? Is you can't pull a guitar part from a song they haven't created in the show yet. Right. So you do have to watch kind of like all of those things in terms of it. So it's a lot of organization, it's a lot of detail work. Shows like that are a lot of detail work.
And I assume that on a limited series, that was a limited series, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
You have a little bit more time than, say, episodic television.
Yes, a lot. Yeah, you typically get a lot more time, which is great because on a show like that, you would need it. Yeah.
Because I think on Ted Lasso, I know it features a lot of songs. The songs are really the score in a sense with that show.
Yeah.
Anything? I know that one of your partners worked on that, but you said there might be some things that were interesting to talk about.
Well, it is different.
Fabulous show. So
yeah, it is different in the sense that like a lot of shows like that, you would they would lock it, you would spot it, the composer would write the score, you'd cut some songs, and that show does not work like that at all. They start in the editor's cut. The music editor that works on that, he starts cutting the score. Like the composers will write a couple pieces of score and send it to him and say, try them out for these different scenes. And he's literally cutting them up and moving them around. And he's got stems, and sort of creating and getting notes from editors and producers on what he's done. And he's crafting it to those scenes from the editor's cut all the way through to locked. So by the time that show gets to locked, he's done weeks and weeks and weeks of work
okay,
to get it to that point.
Interesting.
So, and that show also sometimes does notes after they air.
For next time. Don't ever do this again. Yeah. Along those lines, I've heard some stories and talked to a couple of editors, and I'm curious to your experience that, and I don't know if this is less prevalent in quote unquote television, whatever that is nowadays, versus film, but in terms of, say, the scoring being done and then they're still cutting the picture, and so now the music editor has to craft new cues from existing music or even create new things. Have you run into that before? And I'm curious, I'm sure your musical background has helped you tremendously with that, but I'm curious to your experiences.
Yeah, all the time. So there's a couple of things in there, like when you're conforming, that can happen. Like we spotted to a network cut, and now we've got the locked picture the day before we go to the mix, and so now the cues don't line up the way they were supposed to originally. So yes, we often go in and work with the stems to conform them to get to that picture. There are also times in which we are taking the stems from pieces and creating, a composer can write themes, right? So maybe they'll write a theme for a character or a theme for a storyline in the show, and it is then your job using the stems to sort of recraft that under each scene that the producers or showrunners, whatever, want to use that particular theme. Or where you might feel like the theme is appropriate, and sort of help make variations of it. Sometimes, that's for the final, and sometimes the composer will then come in after you've done that and adjust and make it,
Yeah, do a new version of what you have crafted together so it is maybe, musically cohesive.
Right, yeah. Or maybe they'll be like, oh, that's great, but I want to slow this part down or whatever.
Yeah, so they can redo it. But if the
Right.
composer's on another project, sometimes I guess that can be a little bit more creative on your side of the equation.
Well, and then you have situations like, I don't know if I should say the show or not, where basically the composer was writing stuff and recording it, and then I would get to the stage and they would be like, that's great, but now we want something totally different.
Oh,
And,
excellent.
and then I would go, okay. And so I was taking stems from different cues and creating entirely different pieces of music that did not exist before.
Mhm.
So that is also something that happens. That one particular show, it was like almost every cue, but it's insane. But there's other shows.
That's when you want to be on the cue sheet, but
Yes, but it doesn't generally happen. Yes, a ranger credit would be great.
right.
But yeah, on on the mix stage, you are definitely an on the fly arranger is how I like to describe it. An on the fly arranger. I mean, sometimes you're not, sometimes you're just sitting there and everything is really great and they love everything as it was presented. But then there are other times we get there and they're just like, yeah, no, we're gonna have to change a lot.
They switched to Sanka that morning.
Yeah, they're like, you know what? This morning I'm feeling spicy, and so we're gonna change this.
There we go. And I would imagine at this point in time, with all the streaming, there's less delineation between, say, an episodic series and a limited series, where it's maybe more film-like for you. What are the differences in terms of your workflow and in terms of maybe the pressures upon your
It's
daily
really, yeah,
hours?
the workflow between like a streaming show or a network show, if you want to call it that, there's really no difference in terms of that. And the pressure really depends on the show and their timeline.
Mhm.
I've had network shows that were extremely pressured. We're doing 10 episodes 10 weeks in a row, or you're going to do 10 episodes in 5 weeks, which I've had happen. And then you have ones where they planned it out, so you've got 2 weeks in between each episode and everything runs really smoothly. And you can have that in streaming too. I just did a streaming show where we were doing 2 episodes a week.
Wow.
On a show that had a lot of music in it. And it was brutal. And then, so it just depends. And then other times, like a Daisy Jones or whatever, you have weeks and weeks and weeks to sort of cultivate and craft the show. So
Yeah,
I really, in terms of like what we do, it's not that different between TV and streaming. There's a little more difference between TV and features, or streaming, and features than there is anything else. But even that, it's just more additional work that you have to do rather than anything totally different.
I find I like working very hard on, for several weeks on something, and then it's over with. So the TV stuff is fun, then you move on to the next one or whatever.
And each one has its own unique challenges, so it's
Exactly,
a different challenge every time.
So let me use this as an opportunity to talk about to ask you about your company. And so you founded Create Harmony Media, or you co-founded it. And what is it, and kind of how did it come about, or maybe even why did you choose to do this? I'm curious.
So it is a music editorial company. It is a union signatory company. So I think it was described a little bit as a collective, which is not quite right. Although I have seen that in music editing, where music editors just sort of band together in the same building. But this is different. We're a signatory. So we actually, pay all the union health and benefits and all that kind of stuff. So in that way, it's kind of different. People are employed by us and we run their payroll and.
Okay.
Yeah. So in that way, it's a little bit different. My business partner and I used to work at a different music editorial company, and we were in talks to purchase it, and it didn't work out. So we were like, let's do our own thing. So that's kind of how we started. So we just said, okay, now we're doing our own thing. And it was just the two of us in this little building here with no chairs or desks or anything going, okay, now I guess we got to buy a computer first.
So it began because the two of you were already working together and you wanted to just basically form or solidify it basically. And then it grew out from there, or?
Yeah. So we started in January of 2019. And since then we have added 3 employees, another music editor, the gentleman who does Ted Lasso, which is Richard Brown. And then we have an assistant and an assistant music editor. And then we have like an office person who wants to become a music editor. So we're, slowly starting to teach him how everything works.
Kind of internship, kind of mentorship kind of thing. That's very nice.
Yeah. But paid with lunch.
And are these kind of, I don't want to use the word collective because we've established that you're not a collective, but this kind of more corporate, if you will, without being a corporation environment, is this more of a trend now amongst music houses or the way music editors are working?
I think so. And I think because when I started, the company that I used to work for was pretty much the only one. I think there was one other music editorial company, which I think was Chris McGarry's place. But there weren't a lot of them. And it's interesting, the history. So music editors used to sort of solely work for studios. The studios had space for them on the lot. And, you had one guy that went to like all the dub stages. And then you had one guy who was like digging through scores and, but it was also on film a lot. So everything was done on film. I mean, I've heard stories of people going 120 beats per minute, need to cut out 2 bars. Okay, that's 2 arm lengths. And then like, oh my God, I'm glad I don't have to do it.
Yeah.
But
unless it's Jerry Goldsmith, then it's 2 3/4 of an arm length because he's in 7/8 all the time. But
right. So just weird. It's like, oh, okay, that's a different skill set that I don't have. But so they started all at the studio, sort of working together, and then the studio sort of broke that up, and all music editors became freelance. And so then there were like 2 guys who decided that, well, that's not very helpful, and they decided to make their own music editorial company. Now there are like 5 or 6, I think. Most music editors still are freelance. And I get it. I understand why they are. I do think that working at a company has benefits, especially if you're starting out. Because there's sort of this weird thing with the union where you can't be a signatory unless you employ somebody, I think like 6 months out of the year. And that can be quite expensive if you're just on your own, right? Especially because there's like a bond you have to pay and all this other kind of stuff.
You have to have the work to justify it, basically.
You have to have the work to justify it, exactly. And you have to know you're going to have the work to justify it like year round, pretty much. And so if you're a music editor and you're freelance, and let's say you suddenly have 4 shows, and then you need to pay an assistant, well, you can't pay them by union rules and wages, really, because you're not a signatory, and so therefore you can't contribute to like their hours or their health and benefits. So that's because they have made it sort of difficult to be sort of like an employee-owned signatory, right? So, but then how do you learn if most music editors are freelance? How do you learn if you're not learning from a music editor, right? So there are these sort of instances in which people have been assistants for years, but they haven't gained, like union benefits and stuff that they should be gaining, because the system sort of got broken and it was never really fixed properly, in my opinion. But these little companies that are signatories, if you go there and you work there as an assistant, you are going to get into, you are going to be in the union as an assistant. You are going to get the health benefits. You're going to get the hours towards your retirement, and you're learning the craft.
And so, you're sort of you're preserving kind of the old system in a sense.
Yeah, in a way, you are preserving the old system.
It's beneficial for everyone.
It is, because they're learning the craft and they're also getting, hours towards retirement, and they're getting their health benefits and all that kind of stuff. Whereas like when you're freelance, it's a much harder thing to put together, I think.
Yeah. And
And
I think it's good for the producers too, because they have one point of contact and
Mhm.
they have a whole team that can scale up and scale down depending upon what show they're doing. And then they're on to other projects at the same time. So everyone's busy, but it functions.
Well, and everybody brings a different skill set, like if I'm in here struggling with something because, you get into a scene and you're like, I've attempted 10 times and they don't like any of it, I'm trying to figure out like what the sound is. And I could show it to somebody else here and they'll look at it and they go, oh, try this score or whatever. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you put that in and you're like, oh, that works. That's great. So it's not just, you can help each other out. If somebody gets super slammed with, work one day, but I'm slow, I can be like, hey, let me do some of that for you. Let me help you out. And so in that way, I guess when you say collective, it is, we are helping each other out. And it also helps us try to create a better work-life balance, I feel like. And that's sort of also the reason why we do it, is because we want to try to, have weekends if we can.
Right.
Doesn't
And
always happen,
you're
but
all kind of in the room where it happened, right? In the sense of
yeah.
you're in an office somewhere and not over Zoom all the time. And is that correct? Or,
Yeah, we have offices here. And everybody has an office. We have like a hybrid system, so people can work from home for days if they need to, but then, come into the office. And I just think like in terms of, being able to help each other out, or, especially if, things happen in life, somebody passes away or you have a wedding to go to or whatever,
right.
and you're in the middle of a show. Everyone that works with us knows that like any one of us can step in and take over, because we sort of created a system as well in terms of like, this is how, we do this. This is how we set up our spotting notes generally, or this is how we do this. So I could take over a show for somebody else here at the company really easily and fill in for them for a week if I needed to. And show should feel or see no difference really. And that's sort of
I do want to get to questions, and thanks everyone for kind of holding on while we just have the discussion. We will have some questions or Q&A, towards the end shortly. But I do see one here that says, do you have lots of paperwork? You are also producing or preparing the cue sheets for these shows? That's part of the job basically, or part of the
yes,
what the client is getting for their.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's how composers and artists get paid, is based off of the cue sheet. So it's really important that they're accurate and done correctly. It is also very tedious and my least favorite part of the show. But
having done it for myself, I know, I look forward to what it produces, but it's
I mean, it is listen, not all, even dream jobs have some downsides, right? So the cue sheets are very important. We have to we have to time everything out from the final to make sure that we have the correct timing. It goes into the cue sheets, making sure we're getting all the information from the music supervisors on all the license stuff, and that we have the correct information on, cue sheet splits from the composer in case they have multiple people working with them that are getting credit, and put that all together and submit it to the studios. And then they submit it to ASCAP, BMI, all the publishing rights organizations.
And just going back just a little bit here, you basically had, I guess my question is, this is going back to kind of the union. Are most of the music editors that are busy, they're all in the union doing these under union contracts for the most part?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
And there's not a ton of music editors. I think there's only like 140 on the union roster.
Wow. Okay.
So, I mean,
it's one of the few places in music where that actually happens then.
I'm sorry, say that again?
It's one of the few places in music where that actually happens, where it's pretty much all unionized. So
yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are working on non-union stuff. I just don't really know where that would be, because reality shows do not have music editors.
Mhm.
which is really obvious if you ever watch any of them. And those edits are pretty horrendous. And then a lot of animation does not, some animation does. And
Mhm.
that's seemingly starting to change a little bit, but most animation does not. So
Yeah, the animation I've worked on has minimal tipping, and
yeah, it really depends. It really depends on the show. I mean, I know like The Simpsons had a music editor their whole run. And I'm music editing an animated show right now, but you know, it's not very common.
yeah. And I know you wanted to speak to the issue of the union a little bit. I assume that's very important to you.
It is very important to me, and I kind of spoke about it already.
Yeah, right.
I when I started learning that like there are people out there assisting that aren't getting paid like an assistant wage, that aren't getting hours towards retirement, that aren't getting, you know, the health benefits and stuff, I just it bothers me. I shouldn't probably take it so personally or whatever, but it does bother me because I think like that is something that's broken on the music editing side that needs to be fixed. Either we need to make it easier for people who are music editors to hire assistants and be able to get them on payroll probably.
Mhm.
So that, you know, so that they can get those kinds of benefits, or should be easier to become, they call us like employee shareholder signatory.
Mhm.
Maybe easier for that so that people can, you know, hire people for union wages and jobs and that kind of stuff. But the other side of that is that shows don't ever pay you for an assistant.
Hmm.
It's not like picture editors where an assistant is automatically part of the pay. Now
Mhm.
on features, that's something you can get as a music editor, but on TV shows, it's not. So the only way to pay for an assistant really is by having an exorbitant amount of shows, basically.
Well, yeah, and it seems like this is one of those things where the client supposedly might want to hire a company, but they're really hiring individuals under union contracts and then union wages, and so that makes that even more complicated, I would think.
Yes, that
If
is.
if you were an actual corporation where you could hire certain people that, you know, did certain things, it could be a different contract or whatever else, and it would make it easier, but
Yeah, and it makes it a little different. It makes it difficult. And then I also think it makes it difficult for those people who really want to be music editors to, you know, get the hours they need to get into the union to then, you know, become a music editor to, you know, further the craft. So, I would just I would love it if we could figure out a way to take those hindrances away, or at least make people who are trying to get into it aware that that is the situation and help them maybe make better choices about where to start their career at.
maybe
So,
there's something we could do with the MPSE to further that, or, you know, maybe have a seminar or two about that would be, you know, very interesting, I think.
yeah, it would be great. And I would love it if the union would do something about it.
Yeah. Well, we're the place to start, I think, right?
Yeah.
So this has been really cool so far. I want to just look at my notes real quickly and make sure I'm not leaving anything out.
Sure.
Yeah, so yeah, pretty much so good. Let's go ahead and if is there anything else that you want to speak to before we open it up to questions, Amber?
I don't know. I mean, we've talked about so much. I feel like
Yeah, it's been really informative. Yeah.
we've covered a lot of ground. So nothing I can think of right now, but
Well, thank you all for leaving your mics off, but if anyone has any questions, you can either shoot it in the chat real quickly, and I will, or just raise your hand. I guess we could do that, right? We've got 40 something people on here. Let me just see what's going on if I go to gallery mode. Let's see, I know we did have a question, working between television and film as a sound editor or music editor. I would assume you mean that. I think we kind of covered that a little bit. It's a lot of schedule and a lot of time to kind of play around as opposed to crunch time all the time, basically. Is that correct?
Yeah, on bigger features, I would say that's true. On like indie features, you might still get crunch time, but there's just more work to it. Like you have to make record lists and, figure out like, make sure that the studio is, got their seating chart set up correctly for the players that are coming in and, just handle different things for the composer essentially to help them get that through that recording session. You might work on the prelays, you might not. That it depends on if they have an engineer that's doing that.
Yeah, I actually have one more question for you now that I think about it, and that is, since you started, basically, how has the business changed, and then also has your job changed substantially in terms of what you are responsible for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has changed quite a bit. I touched on this a little bit. We didn't used to have to temp everything, when shows went to the studio for like a network cut, the network didn't need to see it with music all throughout and as close to the final product as possible. And now that's much more of a thing. So there's a lot more work going into the front end of shows than there used to be.
Do you have any thoughts on why that is, or?
I don't, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes I think, is it because people that are in the studios can't envision it without the music?
Or there are more outside investors or things like that they have to
Yeah,
watch,
maybe more people
to...
who didn't. I mean, I do think this is sort of an industry thing where there aren't enough people that are sort of working from the bottom up, especially like in showrunner and writer positions. They just kind of like come on and they're like, okay, you're a showrunner now, and they've never, they've only been in a writer's room and they don't know how production works necessarily or post works, and so that might be part of it too. Like there's more executives who haven't been through that process. That used to be a process. Like you didn't just become a showrunner, you had to work your way up from like bottom to top essentially, and so maybe it's an advent of that. I'm not really sure why that trend has gone that way, although we've started to see it sort of pare back the other way, which is interesting.
Interesting.
Quick times didn't used to exist. you couldn't make those. It was not,
The director used to have to come over to my house and I'd play it on the piano for them, but that's,
oh my god, I used to have to make DVD previews. So with like a full DVD menu and everything. So I was like in there making DVDs with like,
at least you didn't say VHS.
No, but I did, when I was Foley queuing, I did work on like a beta machine, just like clicking frames back and forth on a little wheel. So, I mean, some of it's technology, right? No more SCSI drives to spin up and spin down. Right. Now you have a flash drive that has 100 times more available data on it than any SCSI drive could ever hold. You can do everything in faster than real time, which is totally different. But with that has come more work in terms of like, oh, we can just change things last minute. So there's a lot more conforms that happen, and just a lot more things that happen last minute now that you couldn't do last minute before. It just wasn't possible. So a lot of that has changed. But some of it's changed for the better. Cue sheets, in order to make spotting notes for a composer, it used to take 2 people, because one person had to work the video machine and one person had to be on another computer typing everything in. And now it's like, I'm on the computer by myself. I got Pro Tools open and I got Google Docs open and we're good to go.
Multitasking at its best.
Yeah. So in that way, it's changed. And I think because of that, we have a lot more that we can do now as music editors. Our workload has, with technology is supposed to make everything, I guess easier, but our workload has actually probably like tripled from the time that I started in terms of like what we're responsible for. Yeah.
So this is an interesting question here. I've got a question actually that they're talking about productions that where the picture changes all the time.
Mhm.
And have you had any influence or power or way of avoiding that, or that really it comes to you and you're responded to that, correct?
Yeah, I don't have any influence over that at all, except for maybe in musical numbers where I have to cut lip sync. And then, you know, depending on the show and their budget and timeline and all that stuff, I can tell them like, hey, can you shift this picture, you know,
Hmm.
slide this a frame this way, slide this a frame the other way. And that's
And-
about the only time I can affect that. But other than that, I have no control over cuts and conforms or any of that.
Yeah, because none of this is going to be really hard, and so please get your part of it right first. That's not going to work too well.
No.
So, let me just ask one other question. That is, what do you recommend for somebody just getting started or somebody who's interested in this to do in terms of, you know, kind of next steps? Let's say they went to school, studied music, studied film, sound or film or whatever. What do you recommend?
They need to find either like a composer or, like I said, like a music editor or a music editorial company that they can get their foot in the door, even if it's just answering phones for that person, you
Mhm.
know, and putting schedule stuff out for them. At least you're in there and you're seeing how things work and you can express your interest in, you know, in doing this kind of work and then work your way into it. I think it's pretty hard, although I know there's some job boards out there and stuff where you could probably get like, you know, student films or something. That might be one way to do it.
Well, I wonder if working on those kind of films would help you at least influence, say, you know, an internship or some sort of, you know, entry-level job.
I don't think it necessarily does because, you know, if you're out there doing music editorial, but you haven't really learned from anybody, I don't know what kind of like habits you're forming that maybe aren't great in terms of like long term. So for me, if I'm looking at somebody to hire them as an intern or as an office assistant or as a music editorial assistant or whatever, I'm not necessarily looking like, oh, did they do student films? I'm looking, do they have a knowledge of Pro Tools? That's important. You know, do they have some musical knowledge? Are they organized? Are they detailed?
Mhm.
Are they friendly? You know, those.
Well, they fit into the culture of your company and
Right. Personality has a lot to do with it, as the soft skills. You know, your soft skills are so important in this business overall, I think. You know, your ability to sit in a room with someone for 12 hours and not want to stab them in the neck is is
that can be true in
important.
many professions, but
Yes, but particularly this one. No, but you know, you have to be able to sit in rooms with people for very extended hours and be able to work and get along with them well and have them enjoy your presence and I think that's such an important skill to have, to be able to just know that people enjoy being around you, because that's, I think, half of getting rehired.
Mhm.
You can have all the skill set in the world, but if you're a jerk, then people don't want to be around you, you know?
yeah, no one wants to. People want to work with people that they enjoy.
Right. You don't want to be stuck in a dark room with somebody.
I had an old student who is now working in sound editorial, and he said, well, you know, yeah, you've got to be amazing at your job and be an absolute pleasure to work with, and that's, you know, the two, you know. So I have one other question here that do you or any music editors you know also engineer recording sessions? I've done a little bit of that. Wondered if it's something that could try to roll, and is it ever is there any cross-pollination between mixing and
I do know one of our music editors here used to work at like at Record Plant, I think it was.
okay.
So yeah, they used to record sessions, and I know a few others that used to work sort of in that side of the industry, which I think it helps them in different ways. In terms of like, they know what EQ and compression or whatever they're going to use immediately, right, for
Mhm.
things. Which I think is great, and they know a little more tricks, I think, sometimes. So I do think that that's a really helpful skill to have. yeah, I think it definitely can help you and help you in this side of things for sure.
Have you ever seen anyone do the opposite, go from music editing into mixing?
I haven't, no.
Okay,
Mm-mm.
okay.
Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I don't know anyone. I know a lot of music editors that go to composing.
Mhm.
So that happens frequently.
And I think there's a fair amount of music editors that are also composers, or they, that, yeah.
Yeah, it's, we're all sort of, people who just want to be music editors and don't want to be composers, I think are a little rare, because a lot of people who are music editors do want to be composers. So that is, if you're wanting to be a composer, it is a way to get there if you're not, interning or working with a composer directly.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe just almost, and correct me if you feel differently, but being musical is the most important part of that aspect. I don't know if you necessarily need to have compositional chops to music edit, but I mean, or the technical aspects of it, I should say,
Yes, I think being musical is important, but like, I don't know music theory.
Yeah.
I played many instruments and I still don't know music theory. I think I might like more innately know it because of the instruments I've played, but
yeah,
if
I would bet you hear it.
Huh?
I would bet that you hear it.
Yes, I
Yeah.
can. I mean, I think that's the biggest part, right? Like you have to be able to hear it and kind of know innately that is not
Mhm.
how music would work or is how music would work,
Yeah.
that's not in the correct time, that you cut from a 1 to a 4 and that's,
Right, yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, you do need to, I really feel like that is important knowledge, but it is not the same thing as playing an instrument. Just being good at playing an instrument does not translate necessarily to being a good music editor.
Mhm.
It's a different skill set in the same overall wheelhouse of music, but a different skill set. Just like composing is for TV and film is different than like producing songs for, Britney Spears or whatever.
Mhm. And just to try to answer one of the questions I see in the chat here, pretty much everybody that you've ever worked with your company is in LA in person for the most part, correct?
Yeah, for the most part. We
Yeah.
do work with one gal whenever we have, extra work and whatever that's in Nashville. But she started off in LA. She worked in LA for like 25 years or 30 years or something like that before she moved to Nashville. So she was well established before then. And I think that's the part that's important.
And is there ever a case where, like, say, a music house here would collaborate on something with a music house, say in Paris or Rome or London or something like that, or is that
I
happen?
mean, do you mean like lots of people will record in London or Prague
Sure,
or
yeah.
whatever, and they're here, and so they're working with studios in other countries, and there are certainly music editors. Sometimes we work on shows that are mixing in New York or might be mixing in London or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I worked on one that was in Australia, and I don't think I slept for like 4 days at one point, but, because the timeline.
Sure, yeah, you've got to do your own work during your day, and then you've got to deal with their day. So
yeah, so it is difficult, but does it happen? Yes.
Yeah. I have another interesting question here. Here's another. Who do you consider your closest collaborators? Are they composers, editors, directors? Does it vary?
Composers. Yeah, composers are our closest collaborators for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I would say music supervisors, and then picture editors, and then, I mean, we work really with everyone, but in terms of the closest, it's composers.
Yeah, it's kind of, you're a liaison, and then you're also basically making that work kind of come to life, right?
Yes, protecting it and molding it.
Yeah. I like protecting.
It is. Well, it is part of it, because sometimes producers want things and you have to say, like, I'm not going to do that because it's not going to be musical and it's not going to sound good. If that's what you want, then we need to go back to the composer and let them,
let them craft a new version of what you're looking for, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but with the tools that I have here and the stems that I have here, I can't make it happen and have it be musical. And, we want to protect what the composer has done.
Mhm.
That's an important part of our job, for sure.
And ultimately, you're protecting the work itself, but they just don't realize it at that time until they can see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's our job. I feel like probably with sound supervisor and everything else, to help make their vision of their show come to life,
Mhm.
whether that be a film or a TV show or, MOW, what have you.
Yeah.
It's not our vision, right? It's their vision, and we're just helping them in that process for it to be the best that it can be. But within that, it is our job to sort of be the liaison with the composer and protect their work, and also, make it shine in the way that the producers want it. So
Yeah. And I've heard it said too that, music is kind of the one thing that is outside of the director's wheelhouse, so to speak. And that's a little scary sometimes when you're trying to, maintain control over a vision or execution of a product. And so that's a delicate, thing to manage. And I would imagine too, that's where personal skills come in, or interpersonal skills come in to really make it successful.
yeah, and I think people don't know how to describe necessarily what they want if they don't know musical terms, So they often describe music with colors and emotions, which can mean different things. Something that seems sad to me can seem, very neutral to somebody else. So it is a matter of sort of really listening to what they're saying about what they want from the music and interpreting that in a musical way and being able to relay that to a composer.
Mhm.
They're saying they want it sad, but what we have in here is this, so maybe if we're doing this with it, it will give them the feel that they're looking for. So kind of like an emotional musical interpreter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then you're translating often, I would imagine, too. So
Yeah, it is a bit of translation.
great. Amber, this has been fantastic. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I had a few questions that I wanted to ask.
Sure. Who's
I'm Hayden.
Hi, Hayden.
Yes, hey.
How are you, Hayden?
I'm good. I am you said that you were based in LA, Amber?
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Awesome. So I am right now I'm from Nashville. I went to school at Belmont University, and I just graduated in December. And I've been meeting with as many people as I possibly can. I'm trying to be a sound designer one day, right? And I met with Brent Finley.
Yeah.
And he after I met with him today, I met him for the first time. He gave me this link to this Zoom, so I obviously joined in. Yeah, so I'm enjoying this because it's really cool to hear how you started with music. The fact that you said you play guitar.
Yeah.
In a rock band. So I had the same kind of thing. I related to you so much.
And clarinet. So.
Yeah, I mean,
clarinet.
Clarinet's not sexy, but it was a fun.
It can be. You know what I mean? No, so I currently I'm in a band in Nashville still, and I play guitar, and I had this whole attachment to music, and then it turned into, it's actually sound that I think I really like as a whole. So now I'm here trying to be a sound designer. But so I wanted to ask you about when you were talking about White Lotus, like the music in White Lotus, you used the words American Beauty sound.
Oh, no, I was saying that American Beauty was like a score that for a while people had asked.
Oh,
wanted to sound like American Beauty. It was Thomas Newman did that score, and that score was
Because
I love the score in White Lotus.
Yeah,
oh,
I think it's more
my God.
Ennio Morricone kind of influence, I think.
Yeah.
Cristobal Tapia de Veer is the composer for White Lotus. He also did Human.
Cristobal, I want to write this down so that I know.
Yeah.
Cristobal Tapia, it's Tapia, and De Veer, Veer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he did the score for I love, he is one of my favorites. Out
Yeah.
there. So White Lotus is definitely one. The Girl with All the Gifts, which is sort of like this like English zombie movie, which is pretty cool. He just recently did Smile, if you've seen that.
I think, yeah.
Really interesting vocal stuff that happens in the surrounds with his score. He did Humans, which is a British television show. His score is really interesting, and I feel like what sort of sets him apart is he really is very unique with each project that he does. He doesn't,
Cool.
It's not like he has one particular sound where you'd be like, that's Cristobal. It's like his particular sound is the uniqueness that he brings to each.
Oh, neat. Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you also, so do you, I'm trying to like just kind of get a good understanding of what it is exactly that you do. As far, so like you're obviously involved with music, you're not a composer,
No.
but like, so what is the job, I guess, like this, if you were to put it in like the simplest term?
So we're sort of the musical hub, a musical secretary, and an on-the-fly arranger. Those are sort of, so musical hub in the sense that like all the music comes through us, from the composer, from the music supervisor. Music supervisor is picking out all the licensed songs.
Okay.
Which would be like, you know, your Drake or your Taylor Swift or whatever, right? That you might have in there. And then the original score that the composer is writing, that comes to you as well. And so you're helping them, you're cutting that stuff to picture. Usually, and you're cutting it to picture and you're previewing it to producers so that they can approve it, right? And then you take all of that to the mix stage and you sort of are like a guide to help them mix it in a way that the producers are going to be happy, right? Because you've already been involved with them and kind of understand their aesthetic. So you're helping them, right? Guide them through that process. And then you do what's called a playback. And in the playback, producers, directors, showrunners come in and they give notes. And the notes that they give on the music is, you know, really where that's the pressure cooker situation for most music editors, especially in TV. On film, I think it's a little different situation, but on TV, it's like, okay, you have an hour, do these 20 fixes, go. You know, and that's where the on-the-fly arranger part comes in. And the sort of secretary part is you're taking notes for the composer, for the music supervisor, you're relaying all of that information in an organized fashion. So if that helps you, it's
yeah. Okay, cool. That's
Yeah.
very cool. Because like I said, I really do appreciate music in itself, for how like it can, you know, it like make you feel so many like emotions, right, just by itself. But then I think what's so cool about now, I'm trying to just be like a sound effects editor or sound designer or whatever, but I appreciate music and how in film I think music can be just even more powerful. And it was just really cool to hear your relation to music and stuff, because it's very similar to me. I never learned music theory or anything, and it's just a lot of fun. Music is so great.
It is. It's it's what bonds us all together. I feel like that and math.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I see one in here about surround files. Let's see. It says,
oh wow,
you mentioned Christo's use of surround. Do you frequently get surround files from composers? Are you ever responsible for upmixing stereo to surround? Okay, so yes, we'll often get like 5.1 or 7.1 mixes from a composer. That's frequent. It happens in TV as well as in film. I think there's a misnomer that it doesn't happen in TV, but you know, a lot of TV is simulcast now in 5.1. I think Stars is really big into the 7.1 experience. So yeah, we get that kind of stuff. We are not personally responsible for upmixing stereo to surround. That would be the mixers. If I have a stereo file and that's all I have, I get it to the mixers. They're the ones that are responsible for placing it into the surround field.
So Amber, can I ask along those lines then, are you working, you're not making a surround submix, basically, you're just going to give the mixer stems and then let them put it where they want to in terms of the.
It depends. I might be given a surround submix already, but from the composer. Some composers will have that pre-mix, mixed by an engineer prior to sending it to me. And then that's what I hand over to the stage. And then they're sort of, putting it properly in the 5-1 field.
And
Yeah.
are you working in a surround room then, or?
Yes, you can be, although often these days I'm not on the mix stage, but.
But in your own room, is it surround or?
Oh, my room personally,
Uh-huh.
no.
Okay.
There's a multitude of reasons for that, but no, my room personally is not surround.
Do you ever use library music? Let's talk about that for a second. Do you
Yeah.
ever work on programs where there's no composer? Let's start there maybe.
Oh, well, or sometimes you work on shows where there are composers, but not really. We won't talk about that specifically, but yes,
The composers go away somehow or other mysteriously.
well, I just finished a show that had 7 composers attached to it, but they're not traditionally composers, like they've never done composing for TV or film. That's not typically what they do. So then basically I ended up tracking probably 80% of the show with stuff from music libraries.
Mhm.
Like score type stuff from music
Yeah.
libraries. Yeah, a whole series. And that particular show, I probably had to cut in one episode 600 different options for the showrunner. It's a very particular show. Let's see. So yes, we do use library music, and sometimes we just use it for like background source too, in a bar or whatever. We just, because it's cheap and it's wallpaper music that's just meant to be part of, the noise of the background with the wall or whatever.
Yeah.
So they don't, so the music supervisors don't want to spend a ton of money on, a Beatles song that's going to play in the bar and nobody's ever going to hear it. So
I would assume, is that an opportunity sometimes for music editors who are composers to save the day sometimes?
yes. Yeah, I do know sometimes music editors throw in like a piece that they have in the BG if it's cool with the studio and the show and the music supervisor kind of a deal.
I do have a question here, which I think is maybe not controlled so much by the music editor, but what percentage of the projects do you work on use live musicians versus sample libraries, and where are they recorded? Well, there's what, 2 stages now in LA?
No, there's actually quite a few stages to record at. Some of them are just smaller. I mean, there's Capitol and there's Clint Eastwood and there's Sony and
Yeah, I was gonna say Sony, Clint Eastwood.
Igloo.
Okay, that used to be the Bridge, right?
I think the Bridge is a different place. The Bridge, Igloo, Capitol, Sony, Clint Eastwood. I think there's a couple others. Fox has one.
Oh yeah, Fox. So that's right.
Yeah, there's a few other smaller
Oh,
ones.
what stage in the process? I'm sorry. Okay. So in other words,
Oh, no, it says what percentage of the projects do you work on use recorded musicians for scores versus sample?
yeah.
So
And at what stage are they recorded?
It kind of-
Not
so-
the place, but in the process, I guess.
I would say it's like 50-50 in terms of like live recorded scores versus scores that like the composer does in their house using samples. I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah.
And that really just depends on the project, right? If the project has the budget for live musicians, a composer will almost always opt for that. Unless, it's an electronic score, but yeah, so I would say it's probably about 50-50. What was the name of the band you left? Nothing you've probably ever heard of. It was called Cold Fusion. It's the dumbest name. Listen, it was the 90s. I have no excuses. Oh, I meant at what stage in the process?
Yeah.
Oh, for the recorded musicians? It usually happens like at the end of writing when stuff has been approved, typically.
Yeah. So if we just track the process for a second, you get a picture, you start, maybe you temp the picture, then they hire a composer, the composer's already hired, you work with the composer, they write the score, it goes through the approvals process, you're liaisoning back and forth, during that process. Once all the cues are approved, then that's when they would hire live players. If for some reason they're still cutting the picture after the score gets recorded like that, then it's your job to be really creative, right?
Yes, but also the cues may not necessarily be approved depending on the timeline. But yeah, because I mean, the composer has to basically has to record about a week out from the mix, because they have to record the session and then everything has to be mixed from the recording session, and then it gets handed over to you. And of course that takes a number of days and some hours as well. So, and there's a whole point of like, the copyist has to get everything ready for the musicians. So really about a week before the mix would be probably the last moment you could do it. And there are sometimes shows where like after you've mixed an episode, they want changes. So in the next recording session, they'll pick up the change and then you go back into that previous episode, as long as you have time and put in those fixes. But yeah, typically it happens pretty close to the mixes typically.
A couple of people asked about AI. I don't know, does that really affect you at all, or just that's you just take whatever you get basically and cut it, right?
Yeah, it hasn't affected us yet, although there are a couple tiny things online that actually help us, because for example, I had a Rolling Stone song I needed to cut a while back, but we really needed like an instrumental of it, but they just didn't do that back then, when that song was recorded originally. So now there are programs where you can online where you can throw the song in there and it will split it out into a vocal and an instrumental, or it'll split it out into like a bass, guitar, drums track for you into older songs that you could never get before. That changes the game in terms of what you're able to do with those songs and how you're able to weave them around the storyline. So that's about the only way that AI has really entered our realm as of now. Who knows in a year? But
Yeah, we'll see. Is let me just wrap up if I may, and just ask you one last quick question. Is the music editing business healthy at this point?
Yeah.
It has a future. It's
Yeah, as far as, I mean, AI might take over the whole world, right?
barring that little
Barring that, I think, yeah, I mean, I definitely think it has a huge future, honestly, as long as AI stays out of it, I guess. Yeah, because every show is going to want to have music. Every show needs needs support in the emotional aspect of their storytelling. And every show, a composer can't be everywhere at all times, right? So, and to be there when fixes are needed, a music editor is always going to be needed in those realms, I think. And also just like the translation from the producer to the composer of what they're looking for, I think, especially when they don't have musical language, is I don't know where you're going to find that, anywhere else.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for doing this. And,
It was my pleasure.
It's super informative, and it's so great to hear about your career and all the super cool stuff you're doing. And I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope it was informative and enjoyable for everyone else.
Yeah, we got some nice comments here. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. And we'll take it back to Eric.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Perry. It's such a great event. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time, Amber. And to everyone, thank you for coming. We have some great sound advice events coming up. Please stay tuned, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, all.